I am your host, Nicole Will, and we're so happy you're here as we navigate the world with your aging loved one. We are here to come alongside older adults, family members, and the senior living community as we explore the world of aging and elder care with helpful resources, informative interviews, and approachable conversation. We get to do this together, so join us on our journey, and this is the willGather podcast. How do we manage stress, avoid burnout, and find balance when we are caring for our loved ones? It's important that we find support for our mental health and that we can have ways to improve our own personal well-being. My guest today is Stephanie Muskat. She is an award-winning registered clinical social worker and psychotherapist. She is the founder of Compassion in Caregiving, a private therapy practice. It is a mental health community that is for all caregivers. She has experience working with many different diagnoses and prognoses, including all types of dementia, Alzheimer's, frontal temporal dementia, Lewy body and vascular, traumatic brain injuries, mental health diagnosis, stroke, spinal cord injury, and many more. She supports all individuals looking for support while they are trying to navigate boundaries, self-care, personal identity, and stress. Compassion in Caregiving provides caregivers with an all-encompassing platform to assist in the caregiving process. It's not easy and it can be taxing on our emotional health. Today, we talk about some of the common challenges that we face as caregivers, how we overcome those, practical tips on how we manage that stress and burnout, what resources are available to us, and how families can have difficult conversation about caregiving and have clear boundaries, how we can use technology and innovation to support us as family caregivers, and how her experience as a young caregiver has shaped her work, and how support for mental health and therapy can help us, and how families can prepare for transition from caregiving to post-caregiving life and make sure that that transition is smooth. I enjoyed this conversation with Stephanie. I'm thankful for her lens as a mental health and a psychotherapist. Here is my interview with Stephanie Muskat. Hi, Stephanie. I've been a longtime fan, witnessing from the outskirts, but we get to visit today, so I'm super jazzed about it. Thank you so much for joining me.
I'm so happy to be here. I've also been a longtime fan of yours, so it's fans reuniting,
Yep.
uniting together.
Exactly. Exactly. It's so good. And we get to have this time to just share. And I'm so looking forward to learning from you. You have worked in such various settings, but also with various health conditions and diagnosis, and really that focus on mental health, which is what really, I think, prompted my desire to even want to have a deeper conversation because it's so important. Your own experience as a young caregiver shaped your work. Can you tell us about that and how you got into the space of being a psychotherapist and a clinical social worker and how it's really shaped your lens on the world in that way?
It's really interesting because I almost feel like everything fell into place in this weird way. And I'm sure you can appreciate that, no one ever wants someone to experience a health condition that, makes them decline and makes them change. That's not anything I would ever want to happen. But that really allowed me to see things in a different way and allowed me to start this practice, which I'll talk about. And now I get to help other people. So it's a really weird thing. I always wanted to be some sort of a therapist from when I was very young. I used to be that person that people would call on the phone, like my friends even in grade 6, grade 7, and I would spend hours trying to help them through their problems, and I loved it. And then I think I shied away from it because I thought it would be really emotionally taxing for me. I just always thought, I don't know how I can do this. I'm going to suffer from this. It's going to harm me. I didn't know the word burnout then, but it would make me burn out. And so I originally went to school to be a vet, actually. Hated organic chemistry and physics and realized I did not want to take the MCAT, and I was kind of stuck. And I still had this passion for mental health. And so I made the decision to take a bit of a gap in between my undergrad to figure out what to do. And I did a lot of research in mental health. I was very fortunate to get a job at a local university hospital, teaching hospital. And one of the volunteer positions I did was in a dementia facility where we were working with the dementia clients themselves, doing art therapy to better their lives, while in tandem, there was a caregiver class going on. And I really enjoyed being there. And it was also around that time that I started to realize there was something wrong with my mom. And I think it was my experience being in that volunteer position and also volunteering at other locations with dementia patients that made me realize, oh my gosh, I think my mom has dementia. Like, she's appearing like these people. We started noticing changes in her, behavioral changes, and more so daily task changes, not so much memory. But eventually she was diagnosed with frontal temporal dementia, Alzheimer facets. She has hydrocephalus. There's a lot going on in her brain. And I saw all of a sudden my life change, and I became a caregiver in an instant. And I was going back and forth from university to be with her. I'm an only child. My dad was working, and I was around an hour and a half, 2 hours away. So I'd come back multiple times a week to be with her to figure out what was going on. We originally thought she had bipolar disorder, so we didn't know what was happening. And so, yeah, I moved home to be there. And I saw all the gaps in the system. I saw what was going on. I was facing a lot of difficulties myself. I was an emotional disaster that year. I had to ask for extended timelines at school. I was crying all the time. I just didn't know what to do with myself. And I couldn't find anything that was specific for me as a young caregiver. Everything that I was joining was groups for, 80-year-old spouses, which they have their time and place, but I couldn't resonate. And I joined one caregiver group, but all of the other people in the group were dealing with a parent with a cancer diagnosis, which is awful, but I couldn't relate to it. And I felt more isolated and alone. And I couldn't find a therapist that would, target caregiving. So after that, I worked inpatient at a hospital for a very long time, worked with a lot of dementia clients, a lot of stroke, traumatic brain injury, cancer, and through that experience saw more of the gaps and more of what was happening with caregivers. And then it was during COVID when the caregivers couldn't come into the hospital and when they were really struggling, I said, okay, I've always wanted to start something, and this is the time. So I started Compassion in Caregiving, which is my mental health company.
Wow. Oh my gosh. And you were young too. How old were you when all
Yes,
of this was happening?
I was 19 when
Wow.
she was, I don't remember how old I was when she was diagnosed, but I was around 19 when things started to change very rapidly with her.
Too young. So young.
Yeah,
So
too
much
young.
going on. Yeah.
Yes.
You're just on the cusp of your life, right? You're in college. You're
Yeah.
figuring out what you're going to do.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, in a way, I look back and I say, I'm thankful it happened then because we were able to settle things before I had kids and before I got married. But on the same end, I still don't know many people who have parents with this sort of diagnosis because they're still very young. And so I couldn't relate to anybody, really.
No, and when you want to share and talk about it, I think we feel better when someone knows what we're saying, right? Like they're like, okay, I understand where you're coming from. Here's how I overcame some of those things and those challenges. Are you finding that there's common themes as families, is that when we're interacting with our loved ones, when we're caregiving, some of those common challenges that we experience, and how do we overcome that? What are you seeing in your work, not only, personally, but also with your clients and people that you interact with?
There are a lot of common themes. I'm trying to come up with some sort of an acronym actually, because I think it would be really interesting to put this out there. I see the same things over and over again, which makes sense. There's a lot of challenges in balancing life, family concerns. So family dynamic, other issues, trauma, grief, overwhelm, boundary maintenance, and self-care. Those are honestly the main ones for sure. And the amount that is felt in each category is different based off of the person. And a lot of people don't even know this is what they're experiencing until we start getting into it.
Yeah, it's to your point when you had said you didn't even know that what you were feeling was burnout or that term even existed. Do you feel like that's what is showing up for families families is that they don't have the words to put towards the emotions that they're kind of walking through.
Yeah, because a lot of times it's fight or flight with people. I think when you've been going through a diagnosis that is so significant, regardless of what it is, and you are just going through the motions and you're trying to figure everything out and your entire life changes, you don't even realize what you're feeling. You don't realize what's going on, and you're going through the motions, and it's like your heart is racing and you're going through a marathon, and eventually you're going to fall. Like it's not possible to continue, but then you kind of fall and say, well, what just happened? Right? And I see that all the time.
How do you feel like therapy can support those caregivers? I know that's like a big, broad question, but
Yeah,
I
that's
think
okay.
sometimes we think of, I will go to therapy because I'm working through a relationship dynamic or a marriage or working with my children or past trauma from childhood or things like that. I think that caregivers always, don't maybe identify as a caregiver, but then also know that, hey, there's actually a really great tool that I can participate in, which is therapy and my caregiving.
Yeah, we help to talk through the situation, to identify the emotions felt. We help to process those emotions. We give strategies to manage emotions. And therefore, over time, doing all of that can actually change the entire narrative of what's going on. It's really hard work. There's so much happening for a caregiver. And that's why, you're talking about the relationship concerns or the childhood trauma. I honestly feel like all of that is happening at the same time. And there are so many pieces to work through. And a lot has been buried because, as I said, in fight or flight, you're not able to process what's going on. And so we have to process everything individually. What's the most prominent? What do you need to change right now to survive? That's where we're starting. And then once things settle more, it's what else can we talk about? Let's talk about that trauma from the hospital stay, right? The stuff that's really freaking you out right now. Let's talk about the family concerns that are bringing you so much grief and so much isolation. There are piles and layers to all of this. And a therapist can work with you to figure all of that out when you don't know what's happening and survive.
Yeah, and even having someone that is outside of the immediate realm of the the caregiving world, I think is so helpful too, because when we're in it, it's hard to kind of see some of the things. So having that professional insight and guidance and support is very, very helpful when we're in
Yeah.
it.
And we're trained to do that, right? We bring, depending on who the therapist is, different modalities or things that we're trained in to work through these. It's not, some people do practice more so from you talk and I listen. My sessions tend to be a lot more engaging and a lot more processing. And we bring a lot of theory into it. It's theoretical, but there's also a lot of validation. And people really need to know that what they're experiencing is okay and that what they're experiencing can be normal in this circumstance. And so for me, and I'm sure other people who deal with caregivers with the lived experience, we can actually say, yeah, that's normal. You're not alone in that. Plus, if we see other caregivers, we can say, hey, yeah, that's happening to 20 other people that I spoke to this week, right?
Right, yeah.
So it's just validating to know. And
Mm-hmm.
that in and of itself is really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. Yes. Within that, it's that whole idea too of finding balance. Okay, we use that term balance. I'd love for you to speak to like what is actually balance? Is it even attainable? And then also, we have all these responsibilities and our mental health and our physical health. How do we find some semblance of balance within that intense role at that time?
Balance is possible, and I've seen it many times. Again, it takes a lot of work to get there because there is such a pull and a demand emotionally and physically, and every part of a caregiver's life is pulled upon, but it is possible. And what I always try to start with when people are really out of balance and they're really figuring out their equilibrium is to be very intentional about what you're doing, be very intentional about how you want to change things, and starting in very small steps to build up to what you want to do. So for example, that may be, okay, when is the last time that you spent 5 minutes by yourself? And if the answer is I can't or I don't, let's look at your day and see what you're doing, because I can guarantee you have 5 minutes. And then removing that and adding something that brings value and joy and purpose and meaning and building from there. That's not negotiable, right? It can't be oh, maybe do this. It has to be written down. It has to be intentional. And we move from there, and you can find balance. It is possible. It's just, you have to start changing things.
Yeah, and helping, I think, having your guidance and creating some of those questions to discover the opportunity of where the balance can exist. Yeah, we're not always good at doing that for ourselves.
Even me,
Yeah.
I mean, listen, I'm very guilty of this myself. I spend many hours sometimes in a day, if I'm just kind of busy, distracting myself on my phone. It's something we all do. And then if you said to me, "What did you have 5 minutes to yourself today?" I might say no. But then I just spent hours on Instagram. Well, come on. I mean, I had hours on it. It's possible, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So I now delete the app on the weekend because I don't want that there. It's just sucking me in.
Yeah, and that speaks to the boundary, right?
Yeah, yeah,
The
exactly.
boundary, yeah, and I'm sure we'll
Yeah,
talk about that, but there's
yeah.
also practically, I think as families, we want to know, okay, what are some of those tools that I can have help me manage that stress or identify burnout when we're in that caring role?
Yeah. So this is a hard one because everyone is so unique, and some people do not have those innate emotional skills. They weren't taught as children, which is so common in my generation and previous generations. We weren't taught that, how to look inside yourself. So some people might just be feeling off, or they may not even know something's wrong. They may get angry. Anything where you're feeling like you have no bandwidth left and you're snapping, or you're very upset, that can be an identifying piece of information of something is going on here, right? Because it's not always possible for someone to say, I'm feeling sad or I'm feeling angry. A lot of people don't have that ability to target those emotions, which is why I recommend speaking to a mental health professional who can work through that. But also, the main thing with burnout is you're just feeling tired. Like you can't get through what's going on. You don't want to get out of bed in the morning. You want to just, snooze your alarm all the time. You can't face the day. You're just going through the motions. You're feeling really overwhelmed all the time. That is hallmark burnout. You don't want to talk to people. Everything just feels too much. It's too overwhelming. Tools to get through that. I'm a very big suggester of journaling. I love journaling. It's not for everybody, but something that can be really helpful is taking a step back and identifying what's going on, because caregivers often don't have the time or the ability to do that. Can you sit down with a journal or a piece of paper and write out what you're feeling, or write out what's happening in your day? Things may come up that you don't realize. And that is what we tend to process. Also, I'll ask clients to do this between session, and they'll say, oh my God, all these things came up and I didn't even realize that was happening, because you're taking a step back and you're actually going through that. Can you make some time to be still with yourself? It's hard because there are a lot of emotions that come up when you're still with yourself. But can you do that? What is coming up for you? Those are the things that need to be worked on. And it starts there, right? Just sitting and processing and letting that time be. That is probably one of the biggest tools, I would say, when feeling burnt out, to start that process.
Yeah, those are good ideas. And when we touched on the boundary piece and families, it's like difficult conversations. We're navigating a lot of different relationships about caregiving. How do we start to establish those boundaries? And I know, again, everyone's so different, but is there general framework when we're feeling overwhelmed that we can set in place?
These conversations are very hard because they're really emotionally focused. And usually there's a lot of preemptive things happening before these conversations. There's a lot of anger, sadness, whatever's happening. So I always suggest that people prepare for these conversations and don't have them ad hoc, because that can maybe not turn out in the most favorable way if possible. So maybe thinking through or writing down how you want to have these conversations. And I always try to remember and remind people that it's really about being honest and saying things from an I perspective, because you don't want to put the blame on other people. So I feel this way when you do that is a lot different than you make me feel like that. And how could you do that? Right? That's automatic blame. It's going to get shut down. Coming at it from an I perspective, an honest perspective, and trying to prepare to minimize the emotion is the best way to go about it. But again, it depends on the dynamic. It depends on the situation, and it depends on what has happened in that relationship prior. If there's a really big issue, like fighting over a power of attorney statement, that's much more complicated and probably something to navigate with a professional.
Yeah, having the resource available that we know we've got kind of like those guardrails with the
Yeah.
professional to help
Yeah.
us navigate that. Yeah. Are you finding, or do you have any technology or innovations that you also help family caregivers like with their toolkit, right? If we're pulling out different resources that can be supportive, are there any that you like or that you recommend?
Yeah, I recommend the Calm app a lot. It's a mindfulness app. I've tried a lot of them. I always have to say I'm not sponsored by these people. I
Yeah,
just love it. I
right.
use it myself. And whenever I get to stages with some clients where I'm encouraging them to be present, be mindful, we do a lot of body work and breath work. It's a great app. It has so many features and so many opportunities for different variations of mindfulness, whereas I find other apps haven't done that. So that's definitely one technology. I ask people to utilize the notes section on their phones a lot, again, for journaling. My husband calls me an old soul. I don't like technology very much, and I use paper and pen
I'm the
very
same
often.
way. Yeah.
Yeah.
I am
So
the
in
same
terms
way.
of technology, I don't really use it for that sort of stuff. I like to turn off the technology because I find that distracts and hinders a lot of the emotional work. So in that respect, I think it would just be those two things.
Yeah, those are good. Those are good.
Yeah.
Yeah, there can be so much coming at us. It's almost like how do we eliminate all of the distraction
Yes,
and
exactly.
overwhelm when we've got a lot going on?
Yeah.
Yeah. Are you finding that healthcare professionals and the community, where are we at in that realm of supporting mental health for caregivers? Are you hopeful? Are you frustrated? Where do you see that landscape being?
Where I am here, I mean, healthcare is very different everywhere, but I can say in Ontario, we are government funded healthcare. And so, from a public perspective, there are very limited resources. I think there are areas that people are trying to do the work, and organizations led by government groups that are trying to do the work, but the funding isn't there. And so, they try to do it in more so groups, they, like I was talking about before, or they try to do it in short sessions because that's all that can be put into that. And I think there's value in that for crisis situations. I think there's value for that when someone is just starting as a caregiver, or they're really burnt out and they need to learn, what is this that I'm going through? It's very few and far between when it comes to customized, tailored caregiver support. I don't see the ongoing support publicly here. I think it's very similar to the States from what I'm hearing from other people. I don't see individual therapists doing this very much because this is a very hard place to be unless you've had that experience yourself, because you don't fully get it. And I think caregivers can quickly see that someone doesn't fully get it. And they've told me that too. They've said, you're the first person to actually get it. That being said, someone has to be past those initial caregiving stages and have processed their own issues emotionally to even get to a place to provide therapy for someone else. So it's hard. And I get that. I just don't see the support there. And there are also a lot of wait lists for the public supports. And so people are left sitting, and a lot of people can't afford private. And so what do? So I'd like to be hopeful. I see the conversations happening. People have engaged me in conversations through government to try and see what can be done. But I think there's a lot that is not being put into it financially, and therefore they can't proceed. I think the want is there. We just haven't gotten to a place to implement it. And maybe as the caregiver population grows or the baby boomer population gets older and there's more of a strain on the healthcare system, maybe then there will be a realization from up top that we need to put more financial resources into this.
Right. I agree. Yeah. I hope that that comes. And it's to your point too, that it is expensive to privately pay for those services, but they're so needed. And in some ways, when you were sharing that, I was thinking about, okay, your podcast, and I'd love for you to share more about that. Like podcasts are ways, or even this one, where we're able to hear and learn some things free.
Yes, it's free.
It's open to the public. Yeah. Unfortunately, it's not in a therapeutic setting with a professional. So there's that downside, right? But it's maybe finding those ways to pull out some tools, but knowing that if we really want to do some of the deep work, we need to figure out how to do that. So yeah.
So I do have a podcast. It's called Caregivers Compass, and we have many episodes. I think we're over 60 now. We're entering our third season, but I try to incorporate my own experiences to show that I'm actually a human too, and I know this side very well. And I also incorporate experiences from my work. So I anonymously will talk about different experiences, change up the details so that, no one is called out. Obviously, it's really important to keep it that way. And then I have experts come on in the field of caregiving, and I have caregivers come on. And I think it's a really good dynamic of learning all sorts of different situations. I try to have a very big variety of people coming on, and I think it's been a really good experience for listeners, because if they can't afford private support, or they're just taking those 10 minutes for themselves and they feel really overwhelmed, it helps them to relate to somebody else. It helps them feel heard, and it helps them realize that it's possible to get to the other side. I think it's important to realize that I still struggle too, right? And I have my days too, and I still my mom is still here. She's still not well. And so even though I'm removed from it, I try to emphasize that, yes, it's possible to move on. We still have our ups and downs, but people do say to me, you're such an inspiration because you got past that. And while I appreciate that, and it's very nice, I think it's just a way to see that things do get better, and they do, because things were at rock bottom for me. And I think it's less of me being an inspiration and more just seeing that things pass. But yes, that's my podcast in a nutshell.
Oh, good. Well, I hope people go and listen to that, because it is, I think when we can identify parts of ourselves and other people's story, and hearing that someone might be like at the very beginning of their journey, and then they can see that you've made it through these other phases of that, and that you're here and functioning and also providing that support, as hard as it is. And it's ongoing work. I think we just understanding that, okay, we're not going to actually fully arrive, but we will continue to build our skills and our resilience and our confidence in these various situations. So
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's what it is for sure. And I have kids now, right? So now I'm a caregiver for my kids, and I've learned from my experience with my mom, and other people will learn too over time how to pull from external factors and external sources. And I feel overwhelmed a lot with my kids. And so how can we manage that? You're better able to identify what's happening in the moment. There's a lot of learning, and I think it's impactful for the rest of someone's life. So yeah, I agree. You get through it.
You do. Well, thank you for your vulnerability and sharing. It is important that we've got people like you that are able to do that and to go there and to share the stories. So it's very,
I really
very
appreciate
helpful.
it.
Yeah. Part of the caregiving includes the transition from when we are really in that caregiving role to post-caregiving life. And that brings up so many emotions. I know I witnessed it in my own family and how hard that was. What do you suggest, and what do you offer as some of those things that can make that transition maybe a little bit easier as we're figuring that out?
Yeah, this is a very hard one, because your entire life and everything you knew day to day is different. And even though it was hard, there's a huge loss there, not only of the person that you are grieving, but of your life. And so I always encourage people to primarily be loving to yourself and be patient with yourself. It's not always going to come together in one day. And to just be aware that this will ebb and flow too. You will be riding the waves of the different stages of this period of time while you try to figure out what the next stages are. And you don't have to know what those stages are in this moment. Just accept that this is where you are and this is what's happening. And it is hard. Validate yourself and love yourself and be aware that this is really, really hard. And there's no time limit here. You will figure it out. But I think just allowing yourself to process and be is really important.
It is. It is, yeah, giving ourselves permission. I think there's a culture sometimes of everything's got to be fine and okay and we're good. And just being able to say, like, actually, I'm not okay right now. This sucks.
Yeah,
this is really hard. Yeah.
And you don't have to say that to everybody. I think it's fine to appear okay to those that maybe you need to appear that way. But if you have a few people that you can express yourself to and you're not fully closing yourself off, that's what's important. We don't have to be vulnerable with everybody because that's really hard.
I like that.
But be vulnerable with some people and especially be vulnerable with yourself.
I like that. As we learn to use our voice, be advocates for not only ourselves, but our loved ones, whether it's in healthcare or navigating all of the different systems that we have to, how do you encourage families to be a really good advocate for themselves and for their mental health and for their loved ones?
So I think a big part of being a caregiver advocate is to make sure that there's open communication with the team. So it depends what stage your loved one's in, where they're at. But if they're in a hospital setting, for example, being an advocate of your own mental health means saying what you need in that moment and also what suits you. So if you are getting mixed information from a team, being able to say, hey, I really need to have a meeting with the whole team because I'm feeling very confused, which is impacting my mental health right now. And that's not doing any good for the caregiver. Let's have a meeting. These are the times that work for me, right? It's not selfish to come out there and say what works for you because you are struggling. And so putting it out there, saying what you need in a, not in a mean way, but in a relatively nice way. I work inpatient at a hospital, and sometimes we do have to be guided. We are balancing a million different things. Things get lost. It's just in nature of our jobs. So if we have someone coming to us saying, I really need a meeting, I'm feeling very overwhelmed, here are the times that work, we actually like that because that helps us. And then we want to help, right? And we want to be there for other people. So giving us guidance, telling us when you're available and not available. So you're not getting calls at 9 p.m. from the team with an update, right? That's not when you want it. That's when you're unwinding for bed. Here are the times I prefer to get an update, if possible, 11 a.m., 1 p.m. They can write it in the chart. And if possible, that's when they're reaching out. So you're in your best headspace. You're not facing these unknowns. And also, I don't know if you've experienced, but getting calls from the hospital is the most terrifying thing, right?
Yeah.
What happened to my loved one? Why are they calling me at 9 p.m., right? You think something horrible has happened. So putting it on your own terms is really, really important so that there's not some sudden emergency or you've missed a call and then you call back and you can't find the doctor because they've left the unit. Those sort of things. So just direct your care and let it be known what you can do. I would also recommend saying who point people are so that it's not all on you. If possible, this is my sister. This is my aunt. This is my friend. If you can't reach me, call them. I can't be reached at this time. Call them. Those are really important things because we don't know those things, right? And then we're just burdening the caregiver.
It's a really good idea. Such a good idea. You've worked with so many various people and people that are experiencing different diagnoses in their life. And so I want people to understand the breadth of your work and how you support families. So I would love for you to share in all the different ways and kinds of people that you've interacted with and support them in their caregiving, but also the many ways you provide support and resources and where we can learn more and work with you.
Yeah, there are a lot. I've changed areas throughout the year. So from an inpatient perspective, so that's on the hospital unit. When someone is admitted to the hospital, I'm a social worker on the unit. So I have worked with cardiac surgery patients, orthopedic surgery patients, dementia patients, stroke patients, traumatic brain injury, anoxic brain injury, cancer. A lot of people who unfortunately are passing away from cancer. Gynecological cancers is what I work in right now. Plastic surgery. I've kind of done most of where you can find people in the hospital. And I've been very lucky to have gotten a lot of different experiences. Also, a lot of people in hospital, not acutely ill, but waiting for an alternative facility like long-term care, retirement home, home with extensive supports. I've worked with homeless individuals who have dementia, all sorts of people. And I have my individual practice. And so I support a lot of caregivers in my practice. In the hospital, it's caregivers, patients, and families. In my private practice, it's mostly caregivers. I do support others, but that's primarily what it is. And I have clients who are caring for somebody right now with Alzheimer's, with a stroke, with cancers, with all sorts of things. I have people who are caring for children with a developmental diagnosis, with acute illnesses, long-term medical illnesses. And so I bring all of my knowledge together and try to support these people. And even those without illnesses, just, parents who are struggling to care and are also dealing with their parents. And maybe their parents don't have a diagnosis, but they're still managing them, right? That I deal with too. So if you want to find more about me, you can check out my website. It's compassionandcaregiving.com. I have an Instagram feed where I provide free tidbits and support, and that's at Compassion and Caregiving on Instagram, and Facebook at Compassion and Caregiving. We have a page there also.
That's great. And then podcast is on.
Yes, my podcast.
All the
everywhere. It's everywhere. So wherever you find your podcast, that's where you'll find my podcast. And that's Caregivers Compass.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I love your perspective. I love your lens. I know that you've had to walk your own road, and now you're just fueling that to do such good work in this space. So I appreciate it. And I'm so happy that we know each other, and we're going to keep in touch. So
we will.
Yes.
Thanks, Nicole. It's been such a pleasure. Yeah. And I love what you're doing. And I'm so honored to be here. I was so excited when I had the opportunity. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you for listening today. If you enjoyed our episode, please subscribe and give us 5 stars. In all honesty, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for listening to our episode.